Welcome to the 8th reading of George Orwell's Coming Up for Air. We begin on Part 2, Chapter 10. I was living in a boarding house in Ealing. The years were rolling on, or crawling on. Lord Binfield had passed almost out of my memory. I was the usual young city worker who scoots for the 8.15 and intrigues for the other fellow's jobs. I was fairly well thought of in the firm and pretty satisfied with life. The post-war success dope had caught me, more or less. You remember the line of talk: pep, punch, grit, and sand. Get on or get out. There's plenty of room at the top. You can't keep a good man down. And the ads in the magazines about the chap that the boss clapped on the shoulder, and the keen-jawed executive who pulls down the big dough and attributes his success to so-and-so's correspondence course. It's funny how we all swallowed it, even blokes like me to whom it hadn't the smallest application, because I'm neither a go-getter nor a down-and-out, and I'm by nature incapable of being either. But it was the spirit of the time. Get on, make good. If you see a man down, jump on his guts before he gets up again. Of course, this was in the early 20s, when some of the efforts of the war had worn off and the slump hadn't yet arrived to knock the stuffing out of us. I had an A subscription at Boots and went to half-crown dances and belonged to a local tennis club. You know how those tennis clubs in a genteel suburbs, little wooden pavilions and high wire netting enclosures where young chaps in rather badly cut white flannels prance up and down, shooting 1540 and vantage all in voices which are tolerable imitations of the upper crust. I learnt to play tennis, didn't dance too badly, and got on well with the girls. At nearly 30, I wasn't a bad-looking chap with my red face and butter-colored hair, and in those days it was still a point in our favor to have fought in the war. I never, then or at any other time, succeeded in looking like a gentleman, but on the other hand, you probably wouldn't have taken me for the son of a small shopkeeper in a country town. I could keep my end up in the rather mixed society of a place like Ealing, where the office employee class overlaps with the middle professional class. It was at the tennis that I met Hilda. At that time, Hilda was 24. She was a small, slim, rather timid girl with dark hair, beautiful movements, and, because of having very large eyes, a distinct resemblance to a hare. She was one of those people who never said much, but remains on the edge of any conversation that's going on and gives the impression that they are listening. If she said anything at all, it was usually, "Oh yes, I think so too," agreeing with whoever had spoken last. At tennis she hopped about very gracefully and didn't play badly, but somehow had a helpless, childish air. Her surname was Vincent. If you are married, there had always been times when you've said to yourself, "Why the hell did I do it?" And God knows I've said it often enough about Hilda. And once again, looking at it across 15 years, why did I marry Hilda? Partly, of course, she was young and in a way very pretty. Beyond that, I can only say that because she came of totally different origins from myself, it was very difficult for me to get any grasp of what she was really like. I had to marry her first and find out about that afterwards, whereas if I'd married, say, Elsie Waters, I'd have known what I was marrying. Hilda belonged to a class I only knew by heresy, the poverty-stricken officer class. For generations past, her family had been soldiers, sailors, clergymen, Anglo-Indian officials, and that kind of thing. They never had any money, but, on the other hand, none of them had ever done anything that I should recognize as work. Say what you will, there's a kind of snob appeal in that. If you belong, as I do, to the God-fearing shopkeeper class, the low church and high tea class, it would make any impression on me now, but it did then. Don't mistake what I'm saying. I don't mean that I married Hilda because she belonged to the class I'd once served across the counter, with some notion of jockeying myself up in the social scale. It was merely that I couldn't understand her and therefore was capable of being goofy about her. And one thing I certainly didn't grasp was that the girls in these penniless middle-class families will marry anything in trousers, just to get away from home. It wasn't long before Hilda took me home to see her family. I hadn't known till then that there was a considerable Anglo-Indian colony in Ealing. Talk about discovering a new world. It was quite a revelation to me. Do you know these Anglo-Indian families? It's almost impossible, when you get inside these people's houses, to remember that out in the streets it's England in the 20th century. As soon as you set foot inside the front door, you're in India in the 80s. You know the kind of atmosphere. The carved teak furniture, the brass trays, the dusty tiger skulls on the wall, the Trichinopoly cigars, the red-hot pickles, the yellow photographs of chaps in some helmets, and Hindustani words that you're expected to know the meaning of, the everlasting anecdotes about tiger shoots, and what Smith said to Jones in Pune in 87. It's a sort of little world of their own that they've created, like a kind of cyst. To me, of course, it was all quite new and in some way rather interesting. Old Vincent, Hilda's father, had been not only in India, but also in some even more outlandish places, Borneo or Sarawak, I forgot which. He was the usual type, completely bald, almost invisible behind his mustache, and full of stories about cobras and cummerbunds. And what the district collector said in 93, Hilda's mother was so colorless that she was just like one of the faded photos on the wall. There was also a son, Harold, who had some official job in Ceylon and was home on leave at the time when I first met Hilda. They had a little dark house in one of those buried back streets that exist in Ealing. It smells particularly of Trichinopoly cigars, and it was full of spears, blowpipes, brass ornaments, and the heads of wild animals that you could hardly move about in it. Old Vincent had retired in 1910, and since then he and his wife had shown about as much activity, mental or physical, as a couple of shellfish. But at the time I was vaguely impressed by a family which had majors, colonels, and one even an admiral in it. My attitude toward the Vincents, and their towards me, is an interesting illustration of what fools people can be when they go outside their own line. Put me among business people, whereas they're company directors or commercial travelers, and I'm a fairly good judge of character. But I had no experience whatever of the officer, rentier, clergyman class, and I was inclined to no-toe to these decayed throwouts. I looked on them as my social and intellectual superiors, while they, on the other hand, mistook me for a rising young businessman who, before long, would be pulling down the big dough. To people of that kind, business, whether it's marine insurance or selling peanuts, is just a dark mystery. All they know is that it's something rather vulgar, out of which you can make money. Old Vincent used to talk impressively about my being in business. Once I remember, he had a slip of the tongue and said in trade, and obviously didn't grasp the difference between being in business as an employee and being there on your own account. He had some vague notion that as I was in Flying Salamander, I should sooner or later rise to the top of it by a process of promotion. I think it's possible that he also had pictures of myself touching me for fivers at some future date. Harold certainly had. I could see it in his eyes. In fact, even with my income being what it was, I'd probably be lending money to Harold at this moment if he were alive. Luckily, he died a few years after we were married, of enteric or something, and both the old Vincents are dead too. Well, Hilda and I were married, and right from the start it was a flop. Why did you marry her, you say? Why did you marry yours? These things happen to us. I wonder whether you'll believe that during the first 2 or 3 years I had serious thoughts of killing Hilda. Of course, in practice one never does these things. They're only a kind of fantasy that one enjoys thinking about. Besides, chaps who murder their wives always get chopped. However, clearly you've faked the alibi. They know perfectly well that it's you who did it, and they'll pin it on to you somehow. When a woman's bumped off, her husband is always the first suspect, which gives you a little side glimpse of what people really think about marriage. One gets used to everything in time. After a year or two, I stopped wanting to kill her and started wandering about her. Just wandering. For hours, sometimes on Sunday afternoons or in the evening, when I've come home from work, I've lain on my bed with all my clothes on except my shoes, wandering about women. Why they're like that, how they get like that, whether they're doing it on purpose. It seems to be a most frightful thing, the suddenness with which some women go to pieces after they're married. It's as if they strung up to do just that one thing, and the instant they've done it, they wither off like a flower that's set its seed. What really gets me down is the dreary attitude toward life and its implies. If marriage was just an open swindle, if the woman trapped you into it and then turned around and said, "Now, you bastard, I've caught you, and you're going to work for me while I have a good time." I wouldn't much mind so much, but not a bit of it. They don't want to have a good time. They merely want to slump into middle age as quickly as possible. After the frightful battle of getting her man to the altar, the woman kind of relaxes, and all her youth, looks, energy, and joy of life just vanishes overnight. It was like that with Hilda. Here was the pretty, delicate girl who seemed to me, and in fact, when I first saw her, she was a finer type of animal than myself, and within only about 3 years she settled into a depressed, lifeless, middle-aged frump. I'm not denying that I was part of the reason, but whoever she married, it would have been much the same. What Hilda lacks, I discovered, was about a week after we were married, is any kind of joy in life, and any kind of interest in things for their own sake. The idea of doing something because you enjoyed them is something she can hardly understand. It was through Hilda that I first got a notion of what these decayed middle-class families are very like. The essential fact about them is that all their vitality has been drained away by lack of money. In families like that, which live on tiny pensions and annuities, that's to say on income which never gets bigger than generally gets smaller, there's more sense of poverty, more crust wiping, and looking twice at sixpence than you'd find in any farm laborer family, let alone a family like mine. Hilda often told me that almost the first thing she can remember is a ghastly feeling that there was never enough money for anything. Of course, in that kind of family, the lack of money is always at its worst when the kids are in the school age. Consequently, they grow up, especially that girls, with fixed ideas, not only that one always is hard up, but that it's one's duty to be miserable about it. At the beginning, we lived in a pocky little maisonette and had a job to get by on my wages. Later, when I was transferred to the West Bletchley branch, things were better, but Hilda's attitude didn't change. Always that ghastly glooming about money. The milk bill, the coal bill, the rent, the school fees. We've lived all our life together to the tune of next week we'll be in the workhouse. It's not that Hilda's mean, in the ordinary sense of the word, and still less than she's selfish. Even when there's happens to be a bit of spare cash knocking about, I can hardly persuade her to buy herself any decent clothes. But she's got this feeling that you ought to be perpetually working yourself up into a stew about lack of money. Just working up atmosphere of misery from a sense of duty. I'm not like that. I've got more the prole's attitude toward money. Life's here to be lived, and if we're going to be in the soup next week, well, next week is a long way off. What really shocked her is the fact that I refused to worry. She's always going to be for me about it. But George, you don't seem to realize we've simply got no money at all. It's very serious. She loved going into a panic because something or other is serious. And of late she's got the trick, when she's glooming about something, of a kind of hunching her shoulders and folding her arms across her breast. If you made a list of Hilda's remarks throughout the day, you'd find 3 bracketed together at the top. We can't afford it. It's a great saving. And I don't know where the money's to come from. She does everything for negative reasons. When she makes a cake, she's not thinking about the cake, only about how to save butter and eggs. When I'm in bed with her, all she thinks about is how not to have a baby. If she goes to the pictures, she'll all the time writhing with indignation about the prices of the seats. Indignation. Her methods of housekeeping, with all the emphasis on using things up and making things do, would have given Mother convulsions. On the other hand, Hilda isn't in the least bit a slob. And she's not a snob. She's never looked down on me because I'm not a gentleman. On the contrary, from her point of view, I'm much too lordly in my habits. We never have a meal in a tea shop without a frightful row in whispers because I'm tipping the waitress too much. And it's a conscious thing that in the last few years she's become more and more definitely lower middle class in outlook and even in appearance than I have. Of course, all this saving business has never led to anything. It never does. We live just about as well or as badly as the other people in Ellesmere Road. But the everlasting stew about the gas bill and the milk bill and the awful price of butter and the kids' boots and school fees and goes on and on. It's a kind of game with Hilda. We moved to West Bletchley in '29 and started buying the house in Ellesmere Road the next year. a little before Billy was born. After I was made an inspector, I was more away from home and I had more opportunities with other women. Of course, I was unfaithful. I wouldn't say all the time, but as often as I got the chance. Curiously enough, Hilda was jealous. In a way, concerning how little the kind of thing meant to her, I would have expected her to mind. I wouldn't have expected her to mind. And like all jealous women, she'd sometimes show a cunning you would think her capable of. You wouldn't think of her capable of. Sometimes the way she's caught me out would have made me believe in telepathy if it wasn't that she'd often be equally suspicious than I didn't happen to be guilty. I'm more or less permanently under suspicion, though, God knows, in the last few years, the last 5 years anyways, I've been innocent enough. You have to be, when you're fat as I am. Taking it by and large, I suppose Hilda and I don't get on worse than about half the couples in Ellesmere Road. There's been times when I've thought of separation or divorce, but in our walk of life, you don't do those things. You can't afford it. And then time goes on, and you kind of give up struggling. When you've lived with a woman for 15 years, it's difficult to imagine life without her. She's part of the order of things. I dare say you might find things to object to in the sun and in the moon, but do you really want to change them? Besides, there were the kids. Kids are a link, and they say, or a tie, not to say a ball and fetter. Of late years, Hilda has made two great friends called Mrs. Wheeler and Ms. Minns. Mrs. Wheeler is a widow, and I gather she's got very bitter ideas about the male sex. I can feel her kind of quivering with disapproval if I so much as come into the room. She's a faded little woman and gives you a curious impression that she's the same color all over, a kind of grayish dust color, but she's full of energy. She's a bad influence on Hilda because she's got the same passion for saving and making things do, though in a slightly different way. With her, it takes the form of thinking that you could have a good time without paying for it. She's forever nosing out bargains and amusements that don't cost money. With people like that, it doesn't matter a damn whether you want a thing or not. It's merely a question of whether you can get it on the cheap. When the big shops have their remnant sales, Mrs. Wheeler always at the head of the queue, and it's her greatest pride, after a day's hard fighting round the counter, to come out with having bought everything. Miss Min is quite different sort. She's really a sad case. Poor Miss Minns. She's a tall, thin woman, about 38, with black patent leather hair and a very good, trusting kind of face. She lives on some kind of tiny fixed income, an annuity or something, and I fancy she's a left-over from the old society of West Bletchley, when it was a little country town before the suburb grew up. It's written all over her that her father was a clergyman and sat on her pretty heavily while he lived. They're a special byproduct of the middle class. These women are turned into withered bags before they even manage to escape from home. Poor old Miss Minns, for all her wrinkles, still looks exactly like a child. It's still a tremendous adventure to her not to go to church. She's always burbling about modern progress and the woman movement, and she's got a vague yearning to do something she calls developing her mind, only she doesn't quite know how to start. I think in the beginning she cottoned on to Hilda and Mrs. Wheeler out of pure loneliness, but now they take her with them wherever they go. In the times they've had together, those three, sometimes I've almost envied them. Miss Wheeler is the leading spirit. You couldn't name a kind of idiocy that she hadn't dragged them into one time or another. Anything from theosophy to cat's cradle, provided you can do it with on the cheap. For months they went in for the food crank business. Mrs. Wheeler had picked up a second-hand copy of some book called Radiant Energy, which proved that you could live on lettuces and other things that don't cost money. Of course, this happened to Hilda, who immediately began starving herself. She had tried it on me and the kids as well, only I put my foot down. Then they had a go at faith healing. Then they thought of tacking Pelmanism, but after a lot of correspondence, they found that they couldn't get the booklets free, which had been Mrs. Wheeler's idea. Then it was haybox cookery. When it was some filthy stuff called bee wine, which was supposed to cost nothing at all because you made it out of water. They dropped that after they read an article in the paper saying that the bee wine gives you cancer. Then they nearly joined one of those women's clubs which go for conducted tours round factories, but after a lot of arithmetic, Miss Wheeler decided that the free teas the factory gave you didn't quite equal the subscription. Then Mrs. Wheeler scrapped acquaintance with somebody who gave away free tickets for plays produced by some stage society or other. I've known the three of them sit for hours listening to some highbrow play of which they didn't even pretend to understand a word, couldn't even tell you the name of the play afterwards, but they felt that they were getting something for nothing. Once they even took up spiritualism. Mrs. Wheeler had run across some down-and-out medium who was so desperate that he'd give senses for 8 pence, so that the three of them could have a glimpse of beyond the veil for a tanner a time. I saw him once when he came to give a sense at our house. He was a seedy-looking old devil and obviously a mortal terror of deets. He was so shaky that when he was taking his overcoat off in the hall, he had a sort of spasm and a hank of butter muslin dropped out of his trouser leg. I managed to shove it back to him before the woman saw. Butter muslin is what they make the ectoplasm with, so I'm told. I suppose he was going on to another sense afterwards. You don't get manifestations for 18 pence. Mrs. Wheeler's biggest find of the last few years is the Left Book Club. I think it was in 36 that the news of the Left Book Club got to West Bletchley. I joined it soon afterwards, and it's almost the only time I can remember spending money without Hilda protesting. She can see some sense in buying books when you're getting it for a third of its proper price. This woman's attitude is curious, really. Miss Minns certainly had a try at reading one or two of the books, but this wouldn't even have occurred to the other two. They've never had any direct connection with the Left Book Club or any notion that it's all about. In fact, I believe at the beginning Miss Wheeler thought it had something to do with books which had been left in railway carriages and were being sold off cheap. But they do know that it means 7 and 6 penny books for half a crown, and so they're always saying that it's such a good idea. Now and again, the local Left Book Club branch holds meetings and gets people down to speak, and Mrs. Wheeler always takes the others along. She's a great one for public meetings of any kind, always providing that it's indoors and admission free. The three of them sit there like lumps of pudding. They don't know what the meeting's about, and they don't care, but they've got a vague feeling, especially Mrs. Minns, that they're improving their minds, and it isn't costing them anything. Well, that's Hilda. You see what she's like. Take it by and large. I suppose she's no worse than I am. Sometimes, when we were first married, I felt I'd like to strangle her, but later I got so I didn't care. And then I got fat and settled down. I must have been in 1930 that I got fat. It happened so suddenly that I was as if a cannonball had hit me and got stuck inside. You know how it is. One night you go to bed and still feeling more or less young, with an eye for the girls and so forth, and the next morning you wake up in the full consciousness that you're just a poor old fatty with nothing ahead of you this side the grave except sweating your guts out to buy boots for the kids. And now it's 38, and it's every shipyard in the world, 1938, and in every shipyard in the world they are revetting up the battleships for another war. And a name I chanced to see on a poster had stirred up in me a whole lot of stuff which ought to have been buried God knows how many years ago. Part 3, Chapter 1. As you can see, that whole section was kind of full circle. Like at the beginning, he was like, I saw this poster and it reminded me, and then he did this whole 100-page talk. Chapter 1 of Part 3. When I came home that evening, I was still in doubt as to what I had spent my 17 quid on. Hilda said she was going to the Left Book Club meeting. It seemed that there was a chap coming down from London to lecture, though needless to say, Hilda didn't know what the lecture was going to be about. I told her I'd go with her. In a general way, I'm not much of a one for lectures, but the visions of war I'd had that morning, starting with the bomber flying over the train, had put me into a kind of thoughtful mood. After the usual argument, we got the kids to bed early, cleared off in time for the lecture, which was billed for 8 o'clock. It was a mystery kind of evening, and the hall was cold and not too well lighted. It's a little wooden hall with a tin roof, the property of some nonconformist sect or other, and you can hire it for 10 bob. The usual crowd of 15 or 16 people had rolled up. On the front of the platform 3 there was a yellow placard announcing that the lecture was on the menace of fascism. This didn't altogether surprise me. Mr. Witchett, who acts as chairman of these meetings and who in private life is something in an architect's office, was taking the lecture round, introducing him to everyone as Mr. So-and-so, I forget his name, the well-known anti-fascist, very much as you might call somebody the well-known pianist. The lecturer was a little chap of about 40 in a dark suit with a bald head which he tried rather unsuccessfully to cover up with wisps of hair. Just behind her, 2 old blokes from the local Labour Party were sitting. One had grey hair, cropped very short. The other had a bald head and a droopy mustache, both wearing their overcoats. You know the type. Been in the Labour Party since the year dot. Lives given up to the movement. 20 years of being blacklisted by employers and another 10 of badgering the council to do something about the slums. Suddenly everything's changed. The old Labour Party stuff doesn't matter any longer. Find themselves pitchforked into foreign politics, Hitler, Stalin, bombs, machine guns, rubber truncheons, Rome-Berlin axis, Popular Front, Anti-Comintern Pact. Can't make head or tail of it. Immediately in front of me, the local Communist Party branch were sitting. All 3 of them very young. One of them's got money and is something in the Hesperides Estate Company. In fact, I believe he's old Crumb's nephew. Another's a clerk at one of the banks. He cashed checks for me occasionally. A nice boy, with round, very young, eager face, blue eyes like a baby, and hair so fair that you'd think he peroxided it. He only looked about 17, though I suppose he's 20. He was wearing a cheap blue suit and a bright blue tie, and went with his hair. Next to those 3, another communist was sitting. But this one, it seems, is a different kind of communist, and not quite, because what they call a trockist. The others had got a down on him. He's even younger, a very thin, very dark, nervous-looking boy. Clever face, Jew, of course. These 4 were taking the lecture quite differently from the others. You knew they'd be on their feet the moment time started. You could see them kind of twitching already, and the little turquoise working himself from side to side on his bum in his anxiety to get in ahead of the others. I'd stopped listening to the actual words of the lecture, but there are more ways than one of listening. I shut my eyes for a moment. The effect of that was curious. I seemed to see the fellow much better when I could only hear his voice. It was a voice that sounded as if it could go on for a fortnight without stopping. It's a ghastly thing, really, to have a sort of human barrel organ shooting propaganda at you by the hour. The same thing over and over again. Hate, hate, hate. Let's all get together and have a good hate. Over and over. It gives you the feeling that something has got inside your skull and is hammering down on your brain. But for a moment, with my eyes shut, I managed to turn the tables on him. I got inside his skull. It was a peculiar sensation. For about a second, I was inside him. You might almost say I was him. At any rate, I felt what he was feeling. I saw the vision that he was seeing, and it wasn't at all the kind of vision that can be talked about. What he's saying is merely that Hitler's after us and we must all get together and have a good hate. Doesn't go into details, leaves it all respectable, but when he's seeing something quite different. It's a picture of himself smashing people's faces in with a spanner. Fascist faces, of course. I know that's what he was seeing. It was what I saw myself for the second or two that I was inside him. Smash, right in the middle. The bones cave in like an eggshell, and what was a face a minute ago is just a great big blob of strawberry jam. Smash, there goes another. That's what's in his mind, waking and sleeping, and the more he thinks of it, the more he likes it. And it's all okay because the smashed faces belong to fascists. You could hear all that in the tone of his voice. But why? Likeliest explanation, because he's scared. Every thinking person nowadays is stiff with fright. This is merely a chap who's got sufficient foresight to be a little more frightened than the others. Hitler's after us. Quick, let's all grab a spanner and get together. And perhaps if we smash in enough faces, they won't smash ours. Gang up, choose your leader. Hitler's black and Stalin's white, but it might just as well be the other way around because in the little chap's mind, both Hitler and Stalin are the same. Both mean spanners and smashed faces. War. I started thinking about it again. It's coming soon, that's certain. But who's afraid of war? That's to say, who's afraid of the bomb and the machine guns? You are? You say yes, I am, and so's anybody who's ever seen them. But it isn't the war that matters, it's the after-war. The world we're going down into, the kind of hate world slogan world. The colored shirts and barbed wire and rubber truncheons, the secret cells where the electric light burns night and day, and the detectives watching you while you sleep. And the processions and the protests with enormous faces and the crowd of millions of people all cheering for the leader till they deafen themselves into thinking that they really worship him, and all the time underneath they hate him so that they want to puke. It's all going to happen, or isn't it? Or is it? Some days I know it's impossible. Other days I know it's inevitable. That night, at any rate, I knew it was going to happen. It was all in the sound of the little lecturer's voice. So perhaps, after all, there is significance in the mingy little crowd that'll turn out on winter nights to listen to a lecture of this kind, or at any rate, in the 5 or 6 who can grasp what it's all about. They are simply the outposts of an enormous army. They are the long-sighted ones, the first rats to spot that the ship is sinking. Quick, quick, the fascists are coming. Spanners ready, boys. Smash others or they'll smash you. So terrified of the future that we are jumping straight into it like a rabbit diving down a boa constrictor's throat. And what happened to chaps like me when we get fascists in England, the truth is probably won't make the slightest difference. As for the lecturer and those 4 communists in the audience, yes, it'll make a plenty difference to them. They'll be smashing faces or having their own smashed, according to who's winning. But the ordinary minding chaps like me will be carrying on just as usual, and yet it frightens me. I tell you, it frightens me. I just started to wonder why when the lecturer stopped and sat down. There was the usual hollow little sound of clapping that you get when there are only about 15 people in the audience, and then old Witchett said his piece, and before you could say Jack Robinson, the 4 communists were on their feet together. They had a good dog fight, and then went on for about 10 minutes, full of a lot of stuff that nobody else understood, such as dialectical materialism, and then destiny of the proletariat, and what Lenin said in 1918. Then the lecturer, who had a drink of water, stood up and gave a summing up that made the Trockist wiggle about on his chair, but pleased the other 3, and the dog fight went on unofficially for a bit longer. Nobody else did any talking. Hilda and the others had cleared off the moment the lecture ended. Probably they were afraid they were going to be collected to pay for the hire of the hall. The little woman with red hair was staying to finish her row. You could hear her counting her stitches in a whisper while the others argued, and Witchett sat and beamed at whoever happened to be speaking, and you could see him thinking how interesting it all was and making mental notes, and the girl with black hair looked from one to the other with her mouth open a little, and the old laborer, looking rather like a seal, with his droopy mustache and his overcoat up to his ears, sat looking up at them, wondering what the hell it was all about. And finally I got up and began to put on my overcoat. The dogfight had turned into a private row between the little Trotkist and the boys with fair hair. They were arguing about whether you ought to join the army if war broke out. As I edged my way along the row of chairs to get out, the fair-haired one appealed to me. Mr. Bowling, look here. If war broke out and we had the chance to smash fascism once and for all, wouldn't you fight if you were young, I mean? I suppose he thinks I'm about 60. You bet I wouldn't, I said. I had enough to go on with last time. But to smash fascism? Oh, bash fascism. That's been enough smashing done already, if you ask me. The little Trotskyist chips in with social patriotism and betrayal of the workers, but the other cut him short. But you're thinking of 1914. That was just an ordinary imperialist war. This time it's different. Look here. When you hear about what's going on in Germany and the concentration camps and the Nazis beating people up with rubber truncheons and making the Jews spit in each other's faces, doesn't it make your blood coil? They're always going on about your blood boiling. Just the same phrase during the war, I remember. I went off the boil in 1916, I told him, and so you know what a trench smells like. and then all of a sudden I seemed to see him. It was as if I hadn't properly seen him till the moment. A very young, eager face might have belonged to a good-looking schoolboy, and the blue eyes and the tow-colored hair gazed into mine, and for a moment, actually, he'd got tears in his eyes, felt as strongly as all that about the German Jews. But, as a matter of fact, I knew just what he felt. He's a hefty lad, probably plays rubber for the bank, got brains too, and here he is, bank clerk in a godless suburb, sitting behind the frosted window, entering figures in the ledger, counting piles of notes, bum-sucking to the manager. Feels like life is rotting away, and all the while, over in Europe, the big stuff's happening. Shells bursting over the trenches and waves of infantry charging through the drifts of smoke. Probably some of his pals are fighting in Spain. Of course, he's spoiling for a war. How could you blame him? For a moment, I had a peculiar feeling that he was my son, which, in point of years, he might have been. And I thought of what that sweltering hot day in August, when the newsboys stuck up the poster, England declares war on Germany, and we all rushed out onto the pavement in our little aprons and cheered. Listen, son, I said, you've got it all wrong. In 1914, we thought it was going to be a glorious business. Well, it wasn't. It was just a bloody mess. If it comes again, you keep out of it. Why should you go get your body plugged full of lead? Keep it for some girl. You think war's all heroism and VC charges, but I'll tell you it isn't like that. You don't have bayonet charges nowadays, and when you do, it isn't like you imagine. You don't feel like a hero. All you know is that you had no sleep for 3 days and stink like a polecat. You're pissing your bags with fright, and your hands are so cold you can't hold your rifle. But that doesn't matter a damn either. It's the things that happen afterwards. Making no impression, of course. They just think you're out of date. Might as well stand at the door of a knocking shop handing out tracts. The people were beginning to clear off. Witchett was making the lecturer home. The 3 communists and the little Jew went up the road together, and they were going at it again with proletarian solidarity and dialectic of the dialectic. And the Trotsky said in 1917, "They're all the same, really." It was a damp, still, very black night. The lamps seemed to hang in the darkness like stars and didn't light the road. In the distance, you could hear the trains booing along in the high street. I wanted a drink, but it was nearly 10, and the nearest pub was half a mile away. Besides, I wanted somebody to talk to, in the way you can't talk in a pub. It was funny how my brain, had been on the go all day, partly the result of not working, of course, and partly of the new false teeth, which had kind of freshened me up. All day I'd been brooding on the future and the past. I wanted to talk about the bad time that's either coming or isn't coming. The slogans and the colored shirts and the streamlined med from Eastern Europe who were going to knock old England cockeyed. Hopeless trying to talk to Hilda, suddenly occurred to me to go and look up old Porteus, who's a pal of mine and keeps late hours. Porteus is a retired public school master. He lives in rooms which luckily are in the lower half of the house, in the old part of town near the church. He's a bachelor, of course. You can't imagine that kind married, living all alone with his books and his pipe, and has a woman in to do for him. He's a learned kind of chap with his Greek and Latin and poetry and all that. I suppose that if the local left book club branch represents progress, old Porteus stands for culture. Neither of them cuts much ice in West Bletchley. The light was burning in the little room where old Porteus sits reading till all hours of the night. As I tapped on the front door, he came strolling out as usual, with his pipe between his teeth and his fingers in a book to keep his place. He's rather a striking-looking chap, very tall, with curly grey hair and a thin, dreamy kind of face that's a bit discolored, but might also belong to a boy, although he must be nearly 60. It's funny how some of these public school and university chaps manage to look like boys till their dying day. It's something in their movements. Old Porteus has got a way of strolling up and down with that handsome head of his, with the grey curls held a little back that makes you feel that all the while he's dreaming about some poem or other and isn't conscious of what's going on around him. You can't look at him without seeing the way he's lived written all over him. Public school, Oxford, and then back to his old school as a master. whole life lived in an atmosphere of Latin, Greek, and cricket. He's got all the mannerisms. Always wears an old Harris tweed jacket, an old gray flannel bag with he likes you to call disgraceful, smokes a pipe, and looks down on cigarettes. And though he sits up half the night, I bet he has a cold bath every morning. I suppose from his point of view, I'm a bit of a bounder. I haven't been to a public school, I don't know any Latin, and I don't even want to. He tells me sometimes that it's a pity I'm insensible to beauty, which I suppose is a polite way of saying that I've got no education. All the same, I like him. He's very hospitable, and in the right kind of way, always ready to have you in and talk to all hours, and always got drinks handy. When you live in a house like ours, more or less, infected by women and kids, it does you good to get out of it sometimes into a bachelor's atmosphere, a kind of book pipe fire atmosphere, and the classy Oxford feeling of nothing mattering except books and poetry and Greek statues, and nothing worthy mentioning having happened since the Goths sacked Rome. Sometimes that's a comfort too. He shoved me into the old leather armchair by the fire and dished out whiskey and soda. I've never been his sitting room when it wasn't dim with pipe smoke. The ceiling is almost black. It's a smallish room, and except for the door and the window and the space over the fireplace, the walls are covered with books from the floor right to the ceiling. On the mantelpiece there are all the things you'd expect. A row of old briar pipes, all filthy, a few Greek silver coins, a tobacco jar with the arms of old Porteous College on it, and a little earthenware lamp, which he told me he dug up on some mountain in Sicily. Over the mantelpiece there are photos of Greek statues. There's a big one in the middle of a woman with wings on, no head, who looks as if she was stepping out to catch a bus. I remember how shocked old Porteous was when the first time I saw it. Not knowing any better, I asked him why they didn't stick a head on it. Porteous started refilling his pipe from the jar on the mantelpiece. That intolerable woman upstairs has purchased a wireless set, he said. I had been hoping to live the rest of my life out of the sound of those things. I suppose there is nothing one can do. Do you happen to know the legal position? I told him there was nothing one could do. I rather like the Oxfordy way, he says, tolerable, and it tickles me. In 1938, to find someone objecting to having a radio in the house. Porteous was strolling up and down in his usual dreamy way, with his hands on his coat pockets and his pipe between his teeth, and almost instantly he'd begun talking about some law against musical instruments that was passed in Athens in the time of Paracelsus. It's always that way with old Porteous. All his talk is about things that happened centuries ago. Whatever you start off with, it always comes back to statues and poetry and Greek and Romans. If you mention the Queen Mary, he'd start telling you about Phoenician triremes. He never reads a modern book, refuses to know their names, never looks at any newspaper except the Times, and takes a pride in telling you that he's never been to the pictures. Except for a few poets like Keats and Wordsworth, he thinks the modern world, and for his point of view, the modern world is the last 2,000 years, just oughtn't to have happened. I'm part of the modern world myself, but I like to hear him talk. He'll stroll around the shelves and haul out first one book and then another, and now and again he'll redo a piece between little puffs of smoke, generally having to translate it from the Latin or something as he goes. It's all kind of peaceful, kind of mellow, all a little like a schoolmaster, and yet it soothes you somehow. While you listen, you aren't in the same world as Traitons and gas bills and insurance companies. It's all tremples and olive trees and peacocks and elephants and chaps in the arena with their nets and tridents and winged lions and eunuchs and galleys and catapults and generals in brass armor galloping their horses over the soldiers' shields. It's funny that he never cottoned on to a chap like me. But it's one of the advantages of being fat that you can fit into almost any society. Besides, we meet on common grounds when it comes to dirty stories. They are the one modern thing he cares about, though, as he always reminds me, they aren't modern. He's rather old maidish about it. always telling a story in a veiled kind of way. Sometimes he'll pick out some Latin poet and translate a smutty rhyme, leaving a lot to your imagination, or he'll drop hints about the private lives of the Roman emperors and the things that went on in the temples of Ashtaroth. They seem to have been a bad lot, those Greeks and Romans. Old Porteous had got photographs of wall paintings somewhere in Italy that would make your hair curl. When I'm fed up with business and home life, it's often done me a lot of good to go and talk with Porteous. But tonight it didn't seem to. My mind was still running on the same lines as it had been all day. Just as I'd done with the Left Book Club lecturer, I didn't exactly listen to the Porteous was saying, only to the sound of his voice. But whereas the lecturer's voice had got under my skin, old Porteous's didn't. It was too peaceful, too Oxfordy. Finally, when he was in the middle of saying something, I chipped in and said, "Tell me, Porteous, what do you think of Hitler?" Old Porteous was leaning in his lanky, graceful kind of way, with his elbow on the mantelpiece and a foot on the fender. He was so surprised that he almost took his pipe out of his mouth. "Hitler? The German person? My dear fellow, I don't think of him. But the trouble is he's going to bloody well make us think about him before he's finished." Old Porteous shies a bit at the word bloody, which he doesn't like, though of course it's part of his pose never to be shocked. He begins walking up and down again, puffing out smoke. I see no reason for paying any attention to him. A mere adventurer. These people come and go. Ephemeral, purely ephemeral. I'm not certain what the word ephemeral means, but I stick to my point. I think you've got it wrong. Old Hitler's something different. So's Joe Stalin. They aren't like these chaps in the old days who crucified people and chopped their heads off and so forth, just for the fun of it. They're actually something quite new, something that's never been heard of before. My dear fellow, there is nothing new under the sun. Of course, that's a favorite saying of old Porteous's. He won't hear of the existence of anything new. As soon as you tell him about anything that's happened nowadays, he says that's exactly the same thing happened in the reign of King so-and-so. Even if you bring up things like aeroplanes, he tells you that they probably had them in Crete or Mycenae or wherever it was. I tried to explain to him what I'd felt while the little bloke was lecturing about the kind of vision I'd had of the bad times that's coming, but he wouldn't listen, merely repeated that there's nothing new under the sun. Finally, he hauls a book out of the shelves and reads me a passage about some Greek tyrant back in the BCs, whose generally might have been Hitler's twin brother. The argument went on a bit. I'd been wanting to talk to somebody about this business. It's funny. I'm not a fool, but I'm not highbrow either. And God knows as normal times I don't have many interests that you wouldn't expect a middle-aged 7-pound-a-weeker with 2 kids to have. And yet, I've enough sense to see that the old lives we're used to is being sawn off at the roots. I can feel it happening. I can see the war that's coming, and I can see the after war. The food queues and the secret police and the loudspeakers telling you what to think. And I'm not even exceptional in this. There are millions of others like me. Ordinary chaps that I meet everywhere. Chaps I run across in pubs, bus drivers, and traveling salesmen for hardwire firms have got a feeling of the world's gone wrong. They can feel things cracking and collapsing under their feet, and yet here's this learned chap who's lived all his life with books and soaked himself in history till it's running out of his pores, and he can't even see that things are changing. Doesn't think Hitler matters. Refuses to believe there's another war coming in any case, as he didn't fight in the last war. It doesn't even enter much into his thoughts. He thinks it was poor show compared with the siege of Troy. Doesn't see why one should bother about the slogans and the loudspeakers and the colored shirts. What intelligent person would pay any attention to such things? He always says, Hitler and Stalin will pass away, but something which old Porteous calls the eternal verities won't pass away. This, of course, is simply another way of saying that the things will always go on exactly as he has known them. For ever and ever, cultivated Oxford blokes will stroll up and down studies full of books, quoting Latin tags and smoking good tobacco out of jars with coats of arms on them. Really, it was no use talking to him. I'd have got more charge out of the lad with tow-colored hair. By degree, the conversation twisted off, as it always does, to things that happened before BC, before Christ. Then it worked around to poetry. Finally, old Porteous drags another book out of the shelf and begins reading Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, or maybe it was Skylark, I forget. So far as I'm connected, a little poetry goes a long way. But it's a curious fact that I rather like hearing old Porteous read it aloud. There's no question that he reads well. He's got the habit, of course, used to reading to classes of boys. He'll lean up against something in his lounging way, with his pipe between his teeth and little jets of smoke coming out, and his voice goes kind of solemn and rises and falls with the line. You can see that it moves him in such a way. I don't know what poetry is or what it's supposed to do. I imagine it has a kind of nervous effect on some people, like music has on others. When he's reading, I don't actually listen, that's to say. I don't take in the words, but sometimes the sounds of it brings a kind of peace feeling into my mind. On the whole, I like it, but somehow tonight it didn't work. It was as if the cold draught had blown into the room. I just felt that this was all bunk. Poetry. What is it? Just a voice, a bit of an eddy in the air. And gosh, what use would this be against machine guns? I watched him leaning against the bookshelf. Funny, these people, school champs, school boys all their days, whole life revolving around the old school and their bits of Latin and Greek and poetry. And suddenly I remember that almost the first time I was here with Porteous, he'd read me the very same poem. Read it just the same way, and his voice quivered when he got to the same bit, the bit about magic casements or something, and a curious thought struck me. He's dead. He's a ghost. All people like that are dead. It struck me that perhaps a lot of people you see walking about are dead. You say that a man's dead when his heart stops and not before. It seems a bit arbitrary. After all, parts of your body don't stop working. Hair goes on growing for years. For instance, perhaps a man really dies when his brain stops, when he loses the power to take in a new idea. Old Porteous is like that. Wonderfully learned, wonderfully good taste, but he's not capable of changing. Just says the same thing and thinks the same thoughts over and over again. There are a lot of people like that. Dead minds, stopped inside, just keep moving backwards and forwards on the same little track, getting fainter all the time, like ghosts. Old Porteous' mind, I thought, probably stopped working at the time of the Russo-Japanese War, and it's a ghastly thing that nearly all the decent people, the people who don't want to go round smashing faces in the spanners, are like that. They are decent, but their minds have stopped. They can't defend themselves against what's coming to them because they can't see it, even when it's under their noses. They think that England will never change and that England's the whole world. Can't grasp that it's just a leftover, a tiny corner that the bombs happen to have missed. But what about the new kind of men from Eastern Europe, the streamlined men who think in slogans and talk in bullets? They're on our track, not long before they catch up with us. No mass Marquise of Queensberry rules for those boys, and all the decent people are paralyzed. Dead men and live gorillas don't seem to be anything between. I cleared out about half an hour later, having completely failed to convince old Porteous that Hitler matters. I was still thinking the same thought as I walked home through the shivery streets. The trains had stopped running. The house was all dark and Hilda was asleep. I dropped my false teeth into the glass of water in the bathroom, got into my pajamas, and prized Hilda over this other side of the bed. She rolled over without waking, and the kind of hump between her shoulders was towards me. It's funny, the tremendous gloom that sometimes gets hold of you late at night. At the moment, the density of Europe seemed to be more important than the rent and the kids, school bills, and the work I have to do tomorrow. For anyone who was to earn his living, such thoughts are just plain foolishness, but they don't move out of your mind. Still, the vision of the colored shirts and the magazine guns rattling. The last thing I remember wondering before I fell asleep was why the hell a chap like me should care. The next chapter is chapter 2 of section or part 3. The primroses had started. I suppose it was sometime in March. I'd driven through West Ham and was making for Pudley. I'd got to an assessment of an ironmonger's shop, and there, if I could get a hold of him, to interview a life insurance case who was wavering in the balance. His name had been sent in by our local agent, but at the last moment, he'd taken fright and begun to doubt whether he could afford it. I'm pretty good at talking people around. It's being fat that does it. It pulls people in a cheery kind of mood, makes them feel that signing a check is almost a pleasure. Of course, there are different ways of tackling different people. With some, it's better to lay all the stress on the bonuses. Others you can scare in a subtle way with hints about what will happen to their wives if they die uninsured. The old car switchbacked up and down the curly little hills, and by God, what a day. You know that kind of day that generally comes sometime in March, when winter suddenly seems to give up fighting. For days past, we'd been having the kind of beastly weather that people call bright weather, when the sky is a cold, hard blue, and the wind scrapes you like a blunt razor blade. Then suddenly the wind had dropped, and the sun got a chance. You know the kind of day, pale yellow sunshine, not a leaf stirring, a touch of mist in the far distance where you could see the sheep scattered over the hillside like lumps of chalk, and down in the valleys fires were burning, and the smoke twisted slowly upwards and melted into the mist. I got the road to myself. It was so warm you could almost have taken your clothes off. I got to a spot where the grass beside the road was smothered in primroses, a patch of clayey soil perhaps. 20 yards farther on I slowed down and stopped. The weather was too good to miss. I felt I'd got to get out and have a smell at the spring air and perhaps even pick a few primroses. If there was nobody coming, I even had some vague notion of picking a bunch of them to take home to Hilda. I switched the engine off and got out. I never like leaving the car running in neutral. I'm always half afraid she'll shake her mudguards off or something. She's a 1927 model, and she's done a biggish mileage. When you lift the bonnet and look at the engine, it reminds you of an old Austrian empire, all tied together with bits of string, but somehow keeps plugging along. You wouldn't believe any machine could vibrate in so many directions at once. It's like the motion of the earth, which was 22 different kinds of wobble, or so I remember reading. If you look at her from behind when she's running in neutral, it's for all the world like watching one of those Hawaiian girls dancing the hula hula. There was a 5-barred gate beside the road. I strolled over the lean to cross it. Not a soul in sight. I hitched my hat back a bit to get the kind of balmy feeling of the air against my forehead. The grass under the hedge was full of primroses. Just inside the gate, a tramp or something had left the remains of a fire. A little pile of white embers and a wisp of smoke still oozing out of them. Farther along there was a little bit of a pool covered with a duckweed. The field was winter wheat. It slopped up sharply, and then there was a fall of chalk and a little beach spinney, a kind of mist of young leaves on the trees. And utter stillness everywhere, not even enough wind to stir the ashes of the fire. A lark singing somewhere, otherwise not a sound, not even an aeroplane. I stayed there for a bit, leaning over the gate. I was alone, quite alone. I was looking at the field, and the field was looking at me. I wonder whether you'll understand. What I felt was something there's so unusual nowadays that to say it sounds like foolishness. I felt happy. I felt that though I shan't live forever, I'd be quite ready to. If you like, you can say that was merely because it was the first day of spring. Seasonal effect on the sex glands or something, but there was more to it than that. Curiously enough, the thing that had suddenly convinced me that life was worth living, more than primroses or the young buds on the hedge, was the bit of fire near the gate. You know the look of wood fire on a still day. The sticks that have gone all to white ash and still keep the shape of sticks, and under the ash, the kind of vivid red that you can see into. It's curious that red ember looks more alive, gives you more of a feeling of life than any living thing. There's something about it, a kind of intensity, a vibration. I can't think of the exact words, but it's like you know that you're alive yourself. It's the spot on the picture that makes you notice everything else. I bent over to pick primrose. Couldn't reach it, too. Much belly. I squatted down on my haunches and picked a little bunch of them. Luckily, there was no one to see me. The leaves were kind of crinkly and shaped like rabbit ears. I stood up on my bunch of primroses on the gate post. Then, on an impulse, I slid my false teeth out of my mouth and had a look at them. If I'd had a mirror, I'd have looked at the whole of myself, though, as a matter of fact, I knew what I looked like already. A fat man of 45 in gray herringbone suit, a bit that worse for wear, and bowler hat. Wife, 2 kids, and a house in the suburbs written all over me. Red face and boiled blue eyes. I know you don't have to tell me, but the things that struck me as I gave my dental plate and once over before slipping it back into my mouth was that it doesn't matter. Even false teeth don't matter. I'm fat, yes. I look like a bookie's unsuccessful brother, yes. No woman will ever go to bed with me again unless she's paid to. I know all that. But I tell you, I don't care. I don't want the woman. I don't even want to be young again. I only want to be alive. And I was alive that moment when I stood looking at the primroses and the red embers under the hedge. It's a feeling inside you, a kind of peaceful feeling, and yet it's like a flame. Farther down the hedge, the pool was covered with duckweed, so like carpet that if you don't know though duckweed was, you might think it was solid and step into it. I wonder why it was that we're all such bloody fools. Why don't people, instead of the idiocies they do spend their time with, just walk around looking at things? The pool, for instance, all the stuff that was in it. Newts, water snails, water beetles, caddis flies, leeches, and God knows how many other things that you can only see with a microscope. The mysteries of their lives down there underwater. You can spend a lifetime watching them, 10 lifetimes and still you wouldn't have got to the end of that one pool. And all the while, the sort of feeling of wonder, the peculiar flame inside you, it's the only thing worth having, and we don't want it. But I do want it. At least I thought so at that moment. And don't mistake what I'm saying. To begin with, unlike most cockneys, I'm not soppy about the country. I was brought up a damn sight near it for that. I don't want to stop people living in towns or in suburbs for that matter. Let them live where they like. And I'm not suggesting that the whole of humanity could spend the whole of their lives wandering around picking primroses and so forth. I know perfectly well that we got some work to do. It is only because chaps are coughing their lungs out in mines and girls are hammering at the typewriters that anyone has to have time to pick a flower. Besides, if you hadn't a full belly and a warm house, you wouldn't want to pick flowers. But that's not the point. Here's this feeling that I get inside of me. Not often, I admit, but now and again. I know it's a good feeling that I have. What's more, so does everybody else, or nearly everybody. It's just round the corner all the time, and we all know it's there. Stop firing the machine guns. Stop chasing whatever you're chasing. Calm down. Get your breath back. Let a bit of peace seep into your bones. No use. We don't do it. Just keep on with the same bloody fooleries. And the next war comes over the horizon. 1941, they say. There's more circles of the sun. And then we whiz straight into it. The bombs diving down on you like black cigars, and the streamlined bullets streaming from the Bren machine guns. And that worries me particularly. I'm too old to fight. There'll be air raids, of course, but they won't hit everybody. Besides, even if the kind of danger exists, it doesn't really enter into one's thoughts beforehand. As I've said several times already, I'm not frightened of the war, only after the war, and even that isn't likely to affect me personally, because who's bother about a chap like me? I'm too fat to be a political suspect. No one would bump me off or cosh me with a rubber truncheon. I'm the ordinary minding kind that moves on when the policeman tells him. As for Hilda and the kids, they'd probably never notice the difference, and yet frightening me, the barbed wire, the slogans, the enormous faces, the cork-lined cellars where the executioner plugs you from behind. For that matter, it frightens other chaps who are intellectually a good deal dumber than I am. But why? Because it means goodbye to things that I've been telling you about. The special feeling inside you. Call it peace if you like. But when I say peace, I don't mean absence of war. I mean peace. A feeling in your guts. It's gone forever. If the rubber truncheon boys get hold of us. I pick up my bunch of primroses and had a smell at them. I was thinking of Laura Binfield. It was funny how for 2 months it had passed. It had been in and out of my mind all the time. After 20 years during which I'd practically forgotten it. And just at the moment, there was a zoom of a car coming up the road. It brought me up with a kind of jolt. I suddenly realized what I was doing, wandering around picking primroses where I ought to have been going through the inventory at the ironmonger's shop in Pudley. What was more, it suddenly struck me what I'd looked like if those people in the car saw me. A fat man in a bowler hat holding a bunch of primroses. It wouldn't look right at all. Fat men mustn't pick primroses at any rate in public. I just had time to chuck them over the hedge before the car came in sight. It was a good job I'd done so. The car was full of young fools of about 20. How they'd have sniggered if they'd seen me. They were all looking at me. You know how people look at you when they're in a car coming towards you, and the thought struck me that even now they might somehow guess what I'd been doing. Better let 'em think it was something else. Why should a chap get on the car at the side of a country road? Obvious. As the car went past, I predicted to be doing up a fly button. I cranked up the car. The self-starter didn't work any longer, and got in. Curiously enough, the very moment when I was doing up the fly button, when my mind was about 3/4 full of those young boys in the other car, a wonderful idea had occurred to me. I'd go back to Lower Binfield. Why not? I thought as I jammed her into a top gear. Why shouldn't I? What was stopping me? And why the hell hadn't I thought of it before? A quiet holiday in Lower Binfield, just the thing I wanted. Don't imagine that I had any idea of going back to live in Lower Binfield. I wasn't planning to desert Hilda and the kids and start life under a different name. The kind of thing only happens in books. But what was to stop me slipping down to Lower Binfield and having a week there all by myself on the QT? I seemed to have it all planned out in my mind already. It was all right as far as the money went. There was still 12 quid left in the secret pile of mine, and you can have a very comfortable week on 12 quid. I got a fortnight's holiday, a year generally, in August or September, but if I made up some suitable story relating relative dying of incurable disease or something, I could probably get the firm to give me holiday in 2 separate halves. Then I could have week all to myself before Hilda knew what was happening. A week in Lower Binfield with no Hilda, no kids, no flying salamander, no Ellesmere Road, no rumpus about the hire purchase payment, no noise of traffic driving you silly, just a week of loafing around listening to the quietness. But why did I want to go back to Lower Binfield, you say? Why Lower Binfield in particular? Why did I mean to do when I get there? I didn't mean to do anything. That was part of the point. I wanted peace and quiet. Peace. We had it once in Lower Binfield. I've told you something about our old life there, before the war. I'm not pretending it was perfect. I dare say it was dull, sluggish, vegetable kind of life. You can say we were like turnips, if you like, but turnips don't live in terror of the boss. They don't lie awake at night thinking about the next slump and the next war. We had peace inside of us. Of course, I knew that even in Lower Binfield, life would have changed. But the place itself wouldn't have. There'd still be the beech woods round Binfield House, and the towpath down by Buford Weir, and the horse trough in the marketplace. I wanted to get back there just for a week, and let the feelings of it soak into me. It was a bit long one for these eastern sags retiring into a desert. And I should think the way things are going, there'll be a good many people retiring into the desert during the next few years. It'll be like the time in ancient Rome that old Porteus was telling me about, when there were so many hermits that they were waiting lists for every cave. But it wasn't that I wanted to watch my navel. I only wanted to get my nerve back before the bad times began. Because does anyone who isn't dead from the neck up doubt that there's a bad time coming? We don't even know what it'll be, and yet we know it's coming. Perhaps a war, perhaps a slump, not knowing except that it'll be something bad. Wherever we're going backwards into the grave, into the cesspool, no knowing. And you can't face the kind of thing unless you've got the right feeling inside you. There's something that goes out of us in these 20 years since the war. It's a kind of vital justice that we've squirted away like there's nothing left. All this rushing to and fro. Everlasting scramble for a bit of cash. Everlasting din of buses, bombs, radios, telephone bells. Nervous worms all to bits. Nerves worn all to bits. Empty places in our bones where the marrow ought to be. I shoved my foot down on the accelerator. The very thought of going back to Lower Binfield had done me so good already. You know the feeling I had, coming up for air, like the big sea turtles when they come paddling up to the surface, stick their noses out and fill their lungs with a great gulp before they sink down again among the seaweed and the octopuses. We're all stifling at the bottom of a dustbin. But I'd found the way to the top, back to Lower Binfield. I kept my foot on the accelerator until the old car worked up to her maximum speed of nearly 40 miles an hour. She was rattling like a tin tray full of crockery, and under cover of the noise I nearly started singing. Of course, the fly in the milk jug was Hilda. That thought put me up a bit. I slowed down to about 20 to think it over. There wasn't much doubt Hilda would find out sooner or later. As to getting only a week's holiday in August, I might be able to pass that off all right. I could tell her the firm were only giving me a week this year. Probably she wouldn't ask too many questions about that, because she'd jump at the chance of cutting down the holiday expenses. The kids, in any case, always stay at the seaside for a month. Where the difficulty came in was finding an alibi for that week in May. I couldn't just clear off without noticing. Best thing, I thought, would be tell her a good while ahead that I was being sent on some special job to Nottingham or Derby or Bristol, or some other place a good long way away. If I told her about it 2 months ahead, it would look as if I hadn't anything to hide. But of course she'd find out sooner or later. Trust Hilda. She's start off by pretending to believe it, and then in fact, that quiet, obstinate way she knows out the fact that I'd never been to Nottingham or Derby or Bristol or wherever it might be. It's astonishing how she does it. Such perseverance. She lies low till she's found out all the weak points in your alibi, and then suddenly, when you've put your foot in it by some careless remark, she starts on you. Suddenly comes out with the whole dossier of the case. Where did you spend Saturday night? That's a lie. You've been off with a woman. Look at these hairs I found when I was brushing your waistcoat. Look at them. Is my hair that color? And then the fun begins. Lord knows how many times it happens. Sometimes she's been right about the woman, and sometimes she's been wrong, but the after effects are always the same. Nagging for weeks on end, never a meal without a row. And the kids can't make out what it's all about. The one completely hopeless thing would be to tell her just what I'd spent that week and why. If I explained till the day of judgment, she'd never believe that. But hell, I thought, why bother? It was a long way off. You know how different these things seem before and after. I shoved my foot down on the accelerator again. I had another idea, almost bigger than the first. I would go in May. I'd go in the second half of June, when the coarse fishing season had started, and I'd go fishing. Why not? After all, I wanted peace, and fishing is peace. And then the biggest idea of all came into my head, and very nearly made me swing the car off the road. I'd go catch those big carp in the pool at Binfield House. And once again, why not? Isn't it queer how we go through life, always thinking that the things we want to do are the things that can't be done? Why shouldn't I catch those carp? And yet, as soon as the idea mentioned, doesn't it sound to you like something impossible, something that just couldn't happen? It seems so to me, even at the moment. It seemed to me a kind of dope dream, like the ones you have of sleeping with film stars or winning the heavyweight championship. And yet, it wasn't in the least impossible. It wasn't even improbable. Fishing can be rented. Whoever owned Binfield House now would probably let the pool if they got enough for it. And gosh, I'd be glad to pay £5 for a day's fishing in the pool. For that matter, it was quite likely that the house was still empty and nobody even knew that the pool existed. I thought of it in the dark place among the trees waiting for me all those years, and the huge black fish still gliding around it. Jesus, if they were the size 30 years ago, what would they be now? And thus ends the reading of George Orwell's Coming Up for Air. We will begin on chapter 3 of part 3 next time. We have about 75 pages left, so thank you.